It's great to have Michael Moss back on the program. He's the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, Salt, Sugar, Fat: How the Food Giants Hooked Us. Michael, last time you were on, we talked about salt and sugar and fat and how these have an impact on on our tastes and our preferences. And today we're going to talk about the sort of class angle on processed foods. And on our program, we've talked about food deserts and areas of the country where it's actually very difficult to get fresh produce, where it's difficult to find mom and pop restaurants rather than chains that are sourcing their food from who knows where and giving you very processed versions of those mom and pop recipes in many cases. So lay out the sort of initial groundwork for us in terms of the different ways in which class and processed foods sort of interact.
One of the main ways, David, is that the people who engineer and invent the processed foods that we became so dependent on don't actually eat their own products. Often they have just one of a couple working outside of the home. The other can pay attention to making real food for their kids and healthy food. But also kind of in just the manner that they approach the creating of their products. It's telling to know that they don't even refer to them as food, but rather as products, as things that they engineer to be low cost, convenient, irresistible, but missing that key component, which is stuff that would make us healthy if we eat it, or unhealthy if we eat too much.
It's sort of been commoditized, right? I mean, you can really see the gap that's increasingly growing in terms of the sort of two tiers of food consumption, because when you look at in the grocery store, a way that it's often described as the sort of outer edges of the grocery store versus the inner aisles of the grocery store, the fresh foods, meats, dairy, etc., versus the processed foods. Those are sort of commodities where we're sort of trying to see, or we're seeing the big food companies try to eke out every penny possible of profit margin. It's being thought of in a completely commoditized way.
And they control the entire agricultural system that goes into creating the groceries in the grocery store. You don't have to go very far to see a food desert. We have them here in Brooklyn, where I live. You can find them in Los Angeles. But it really came home to me spending some time recently in Nebraska, where people are surrounded by agriculture, fields growing stuff, but not things that they can eat. The food that's typically grown there is field corn that's used for ethanol, for animal feed, for high fructose corn syrup. And people in Nebraska are literally starving for fresh vegetables and fruits, which would make them healthier. It's like being in a third world country.
It's fascinating. You mentioned Brooklyn, where I lived for a couple of years up to a few months ago. You can see even in Brooklyn, which now has become one of the top 5 least affordable housing markets in the country, right? By and large, if you take a sort of mean of Brooklyn, it is very, very expensive and wealthy. But within Brooklyn, as you mentioned, you have the areas closer to Manhattan, right? Williamsburg and downtown Brooklyn and Brooklyn Heights, et cetera, where there's an abundance of artisanal kale shops, right? And the local, whatever, grass-fed raw milk, we'll call it what you want. And then you get further east in Brooklyn into East New York and some of the other neighborhoods, and you have a drastically different picture. And that's within one of the most urban, one of the most densely urban areas in the country.
Yep, and in those lower income areas, you're going to get a grocery store where the produce department is typically 10% of the store, with the rest of it being highly processed foods, but also really expensive. And that's one of the most sort of grievous aspects of our food system now, is that even if you walk into the store meaning to do well by your health, by your family's health, it's going to hit you in the pocketbook. That little basket of blueberries, especially shoulder season, is going to cost you as much as a 2-pound, 3 cheese, 4 meat frozen pizza that will feed the entire family. And so who's not going to go for the pizza when money is an issue in your life?
You talked about in Nebraska the field corn and the corn used for high fructose corn syrup, et cetera. This is sort of another way in which big corporations, big food corporations, run by decisions made by those in the 1% or close to it, are sort of riding the government subsidies on certain foods, corn being sort of at the top of the list. And this is yet another way in which big corporations can sort of piggyback on government subsidies to make these processed foods even cheaper at their expense, which, as you mentioned, disproportionately appeal to the poor, don't they?
Yeah, but I think it's even more than government subsidies because the largest seed companies will spend every year $2 billion of their own money on research and development to make that field corn or soybeans more attractive and profitable to farmers so they'll grow more. And those are the key ingredients on processed foods. $2 billion a year for that compared to maybe $100 million a year on making all fruits and vegetables, including nuts, more profitable and attractive and easier for farmers to grow. That's a huge disparity in the investment that corporations are putting into the food system.
Is there some sort of general advice for individuals, sort of at a range, within a range of different income brackets, to try to improve their situation in terms of the relationship to processed foods? I mean, in some cases, when you're talking about food deserts, you can't just say, well, move somewhere else, right? I mean, it's just not really practical. So is there anything that the individual can do?
Sure. I mean, you can eat well in a typical grocery store by working a little bit harder and thinking about what you're going to buy and avoiding sort of buying too much junk. So, I mean, that's the first thing. You make a list before you walk in the door and stick to it because everything about the store is designed to make you to buy compulsively. Pay some attention to the frozen aisle because there actually you can find those blueberries flash frozen, locally grown at much lower prices throughout the winter and off season than you otherwise would. I'm a big fan of frozen fruits and vegetables as an economic way of eating well. And you can look for some canned foods that don't have a lot of added salt where you can make your own food. I love canned tomatoes, for example. 5 minutes of time and a can of tomatoes will make you a spaghetti sauce that is tastier, less expensive, and with a bigger wow for your family than the canned and prepared sauces you can find in the grocery store.
I'm curious about this, and I'm curious what your sense of it is because you now have reminded me of this issue. Frozen versus canned vegetables. I know people who say, David, it's all the same. If it's frozen or canned, it's really all the same. And more of what I'm reading suggests, no, the flash frozen is actually far, far better than going with the canned vegetables. Is there a discernible difference here?
Yeah, I think you're right that the flash frozen done in the field, right, where the fruits or vegetables are immediately frozen without any delay, I think there is some science now showing that, yeah, those are going to pack more nutrients than perhaps a canned or more processed type of vegetable, or more even than a vegetable fresh that sits in your refrigerator for too long and loses its nutrients. But bottom line is, you want to eat healthier. You eat vegetables and fruits, no matter how they're processed or preserved or saved, it's going to help you.
Last thing I want to touch on, in the grocery store, you talked about the grocery store being designed to get you to compulsively buy. And some of these things I think we can sort of intuit naturally. You have to usually walk through the entire store to get those the items that you might just be going in for one item. Milk is one that comes to mind. We know about at the groceries, at the cash registers rather, there's all these little items that are often a couple dollars, but we know that they have a very, very high profit margin, so that those are there to tempt you to pick them up as you're waiting in line. What are some other really specific ways that grocery stores are sort of designed in this very specific sense?
Besides the checkout lane, the parts of the aisles called the end caps, which are those things that stick out facing the large, walkway areas of the store, are the real grabbers. The store will typically rent out that space to food companies, knowing that we will pay more attention to, excuse me, and buy items on those end caps. That's one of the biggest things.
All right. Michael Moss, the book, of course, is Salt, Sugar, Fat, How the Food Giants Hooked Us. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author, Michael Moss. Thanks again for being on with us.
Great talking to you, David.